Are you interested in discovering the spiritual and theological mysteries of the Old Testament, as well as exploring the current historical and archaeological evidence that supports or confounds the biblical narrative? If so, prepare to have your eyes opened as we journey to Damascus.
Hello there, and welcome to St. James' production of Journey to Damascus. We're having a lot of fun with this. I hope you are. This week, we're going to pick up on 2 Samuel, starting with chapter 11. And we've got some great stories that come from this part of 2 Samuel. Of course, right now, our big protagonist, the big hero of our stories is David. But David is going to have a real stumble today in our story. But first, I want to talk a little bit about David archaeologically and where we're at with what we know about David. Last week, I mentioned that it was as late as, I want to say, 1993. I think it was 97 when we found just our first archaeological evidence concerning David as a real person, as king and as the monarch of a place called Israel. You'd think, because of the Bible story and everybody knowing so much about it, that we'd have all kinds of information from other surrounding peoples, countries, archaeological information, but nothing. And so it's been really slow in coming, but now there's been several things found. I'd like to show you again a picture that I showed you last week. This is a picture of the Tel Dan Stele. In this picture, you can see there's an inscription on this that says Kingdom of David, or rather, let me get that right here, something along that line, House of David. It says House of David. This was a piece of a stone monument put up by a 9th century king of Damascus, who was pronouncing victory over some of his enemy kings in some certain skirmishes and situations, and one of them, not as you can see, but on this stone, it does say that it is from the House of David. Then there was another stone found. It's called the Mesha stone. It was found in the area that we call Moab. And on that one, there's a couple of instances where the stone mentions David on a couple of different instances. And then in this picture here, which is that picture right there, in this picture here, what this is a hieroglyph in Egypt. This particular one was found at a temple in Egypt. It's from the time of Pharaoh Shoshank I. The Pharaoh is actually also identified in the book of Kings in the Old Testament, where he's called Shoshank. On this hieroglyph, it mentions the Pharaoh's some raids that the Egyptians took up into Canaan, and on a list of those raids, one of the places it mentions is the Heights of David, which is a location which is in the southern end of Judah. Now, the interesting thing about this is that that story is actually also in the Bible, in 1 Kings, during the reign of King Jeroboam, when he mentions that Shoshank, the Pharaoh of Egypt, had raiding parties come up and attacked part of Israel and got into the palace of the king and stole some items, ransacked that. So kind of some double corroborating incidents of evidences of this one incident involving Pharaoh Shoshank. Other than that, there's been several little trinkets and small little impressions found of administrative facilities in and around Jerusalem in the city of David, just showing that there was a lot of administration going on, as though it was the center of some sort of kingdom that had a lot of things going on. That's pretty much most of what has been found so far, though. So they continue to dig, they continue to look, but that's where we're at with David and this time in Israel's history of about 1900, 800 BC. Okay, oh, I also want to show you one, no, I got more. Wait, this is a good one. I want to show you a picture here of Eilat Mazar. She is a Israeli archaeologist, and she and her team were working in the city of David, and she uncovered what she believes to be King David's palace. We're going to see a picture of that here. In this picture of King David's palace, you can make out, over on this side over here, I think it is, there's a large tower and a lot of stonework, and then back over on this side over here, there's kind of a ruined tower. Maybe I got that backwards, but you can see it in the picture. This is in the city of David. Miss Mazar believes that this is the palace of David. And then there's one more picture here of a stone wall, which doesn't look too overly impressive, but you can see a stone wall over here where this is also considered to be a part of David's palace. Now, I know we look at these pictures and all we see is a whole bunch of piled up rocks. It's hard to think, like in that previous picture, that all of that was the palace. But you have to remember what you have in Jerusalem in particular, and all over the Mideast, but particularly in Jerusalem, is stone structure built on top of stone structure, built on top of stone structure for thousands of years. And often the builders in one era would use part of a building from a previous era and build on top of it. And then that would get knocked down and some would stay up, some would get knocked down. Eventually, sometimes hundreds of years later, someone else would come along, dig a little, find some foundations, start building on top of them again. So it all kind of gets mixed up and thrown together. So in some of these pictures, what we're actually seeing is many structures over thousands of years. But archaeologists are able to determine by looking at the strata, the levels of the soil, destruction levels, various artifacts, sometimes just tiny little fragments of pottery, and they can start to put together a picture of what was built at what time in history. Even finding sometimes little bits of bone or seeds or fruit pits that they are able to analyze and determine the time period that this particular item was left behind, to help them determine a wall from the Byzantine era, the difference from that between that and a wall from David's era of 900 BC. So those are just some of the information that has been unearthed, and that's about all we can look. So let's get on with our stories from 2 Samuel in the 11th chapter. It's springtime. The birds are chirping, the flowers are blooming, and kings are turning to thoughts of war. Spring is the time when kingdoms go to war with each other, and Israel was no exception. Joab, David's general, had been dispatched with a good bit of the army by David to go and fight against the Ammonites, and they routed them pretty well, and they retreated into one of their major cities called Rabbah. So they've got them cornered back in Rabbah, and in the meantime, David is in Jerusalem, and he gets up one afternoon from his nap and goes for a little stroll on the roof of his palace, on his patios up there, and he looks out across the city, and what should he spy but a beautiful woman bathing on a rooftop not too far from him. She was an exceptionally good-looking woman, we are told. Here's a picture of her right here. And in this picture you can see David looking out towards Bathsheba, the woman that's out there as she's bathing. I couldn't show, there's not a lot of pictures I can show you about Bathsheba because she's almost always painted totally naked. So this one, she's far enough away that I thought we could get away with this one. And that one's by James Tissot, I'm sorry. And then here's another picture of her. which discreetly she's facing the other direction. This time we can see David off in the distance on his rooftop, looking down at Bathsheba. And he notices what a beautiful woman she is, and he sends people, a messenger, to find out just who this woman is. And they come back and tell him that it is Bathsheba. She is the daughter of, she's the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. The Hittites were a great nation to the north of Israel, and great fighters, and apparently Uriah found himself in the Israeli army. And so David sends for the woman. She comes to the palace. I imagine he woos her there. Maybe they have some wine, a little music, whatever. They end up sleeping together, and she leaves, but then sometime later lets David know that she has become pregnant with his child. So David sends for Uriah, and you can see I have a picture of that here. And Uriah comes to talk to David, and David casually doesn't want Uriah to know why he's calling on him, so he opens up with some questions like, "So Uriah, what's happening? How you doing? How are things going? Is Joab doing all right? Tell me about the armies. How are the armies doing? Is everything progressing well with the war? Oh, that's great. Well, look, glad you could come and tell me this stuff firsthand. Here's a little gift for you. Why don't you go home and sleep with your wife? I know it's been a long time since you've seen her." So Uriah leaves, but he does not go home to sleep with his wife. Instead, he spends the night in the soldiers' barracks by the front gate, the guards keeper. And David finds out the next morning that Uriah did not go home. So he calls Uriah to come back, and he says, "Oh, did you have a good night? By the way, why didn't you go home to sleep with your wife, spend some time there with her?" And Uriah said, "My lord, your general Joab and all the armies of Israel are all sleeping out in the wilderness in tents, and the ark is in a tent, and they're all roughing it out there. I couldn't possibly come back here, go home and have a nice home-cooked meal and drink wine and sleep with my wife. I can't do that while my fellow soldiers are out in the field." So David says, "Well, you're a good man, you're a good man. Tell you what, why don't you come back for dinner with me tonight?" So Uriah comes back to have dinner with David, and David intentionally gets him drunk and tries to convince him he really needs to go home and spend the night with his wife. But Uriah leaves, and instead of going home, again, he stays with the guards at the front gate and spends the night there. And David learns of this the next morning and realizes none of his plan to try to make something happen so he can convince Uriah, or Bathsheba can convince Uriah that this child is actually his. This is all going awry. So David comes up with another plan. And in this next plan, he invites Uriah to come to him and gives him a message. It says he wants him to go back to the troops and give this message to his general Joab. So I think we have a picture of something along that line. So David, maybe we don't. Is that it? Hang on, I can't see it. Hold it back up there. No, never mind. We don't have a picture of this. We'll get to this next picture in a minute. And so Uriah goes to Joab, gives him the message. Joab opens the message up, and the message says, "Send Uriah to the front lines where fighting is the fiercest, and then pull back, so he will be killed. P.S. Don't let Uriah read this note." So Joab did as David requested, and he sends him up close to the city walls where the fighting is the fiercest, and then he draws back the rest of the troops a little bit, and certainly Uriah, along with several Israelites, are killed, shot by arrows from the soldiers up on the walls of the city. So Joab sends for a messenger to go to King David, telling him to report everything there is to report about the battle. But the messenger asks Joab if David might not be angry because he's going to have to tell him everything, and frankly, the messenger's not really sure why Joab sent those certain soldiers up so close to the city wall that they could be shot by arrows from the city. It was kind of a stupid thing for Joab to do, and I think the messenger's a little nervous about telling this part to David. He's afraid David will fly off the handle, lop off his head or something, because David will be so angry for this blunder done by his general that got some of his men killed. But Joab tells the messengers, don't you worry about that. I take full responsibility for this. You just go tell them what happened. And, oh, by the way, be sure you mention that Uriah the Hittite was killed in the battle. So the messenger comes to David, and he tells David about the battle, about what happened, and is very kind of sheepish about telling them about the men who were killed up by the city wall. And he tells them that some Ammonite soldiers were actually out in the field, and some soldiers chased after them and accidentally got too close to the city walls, and they were killed as the Ammonite soldiers were running back into the city. And David, trying not to look too surprised, told the messenger to tell Joab, don't be too disappointed. I know you're doing your best. I know this kind of, stuff happens. Everybody makes mistakes in the heat of war. It's just one of those things. A few die today, a few die tomorrow. Some win, some lose. Don't sweat it. It's all good. You guys just fight harder and conquer the city Ramah, and it'll all be good. The messenger's obviously relieved, but also kind of surprised with David's response. And he comes back and tells Joab what his commander, David, the king, has said. So, when Bathsheba learned that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And after a proper amount of time of mourning, David sent for her to come to the palace, where he made her one of his wives, and she bore him a son. However, the Lord was not pleased at all with David and his shenanigans. And so the Lord sends Nathan, the prophet, to come to David with a story. I know we all know this story, but I'm going to reiterate it here a little bit. A rich man had many cattle and sheep, and a poor man had only one little lamb. And he loved his lamb. He raised it as one of the family. It ate from the man's plate. It drank from the man's cup. The man used to cuddle it in his arms as if it was his own little daughter. And one day the rich man had a guest arrive, and not wanting to kill one of his own animals for a celebration, he took the poor man's one poor lone lamb that he loved, and they killed it and celebrated with that and ate it for dinner. Well, David was furious at hearing about this. He said, surely this man should die. He said he should repay the man 4 lambs for the one he stole and for having no pity. Here we have a picture of Nathan talking to David. And Nathan is scolding David here and says, but of course, you are that man. And he continued to tell David all that the Lord had decreed against him, because he had despised the Lord and done a horrible thing. The Lord said, I have made you king. I gave you your master's house, wives, and kingdoms, and I would have given you more. Then in this other picture you see, he goes on to say, but because you murdered Uriah and took his wife, from this time on, your family will live by the sword. I will cause your household to rebel against you. I will give your wives to another man before your eyes, and he will lie with your wives in public view. You did your deeds secretly, but I will make this happen to you in all the sight of Israel. Then David confessed all to Nathan and admitted all of his sin against the Lord. And Nathan told David, the Lord forgives him and isn't going to kill him, but that the Lord's going to take his son that he had with Bathsheba. Well, David is distraught. He prays and begs the Lord not to take his son. But 7 days later, after his son had gotten sick, his son dies, and David is distraught. But he goes to the temple, spends a lot of time in prayer, and comes out kind of as a surprise to some of his leaders, with some resolve to him that this was his fault, and he made a bad mistake. His son's been killed, but he's kind of ready to try to make amends and move forward and move on. We're told that David comforted Bathsheba, who later became pregnant again and gave birth to another son they named Solomon. We're told the Lord loved Solomon, and we're going to hear a lot about Solomon in days to come. Meanwhile, Joab sent word to David that he had captured the water supply at Rabbah, and it was only a matter of time before the city would fall, and David needed to take some more of the army and come there and join in the fight so that it couldn't be said that Joab, it was his victory, but that so David could, as king, claim the victory that he should. And so David did that. He gathered up some more of the army, went down, fought with them. They conquered the city of Rabbah. David went inside, took the crown off of the king there, which was a 75-pound golden crown encrusted with jewels, and he placed it on his own head. And they took the people of Rabbah and other people from other Ammonite cities and used them as workers, laborers for the Israelites, and David and his army returned to Jerusalem victorious. Which brings us to the last story I'm going to tell you about in this part of this is the 13th chapter of 2 Samuel. It's a very dark story, a sad story. It's the story of the rape of Tamar, one of David's daughters. In this story, David's son, Absalom, had a beautiful, beautiful sister named Tamar, and a half-brother named Amnon was in love with Tamar, almost out of his head in love with her, and distraught that he thought he should never have her. But he had a conniving cousin, and the two of them came up with a plan for Amnon to pretend to be sick and to get Tamar to come to his room to serve him some food and to help him convalesce. And when she comes, he kicks out all the servants and he ends up raping Tamar. When he's done, we are told that he instantly hated her more than he loved her. And he throws her out of the house in shame, locks the door behind her. And she's left in shame to go back home, where she goes back to her brother Absalom. Picture of that here. And in this scene, this is a picture entitled, I think this is called Absalom Comforts Tamar, his sister. And so, actually I think I'm standing in front of Tamar here. Here we go. So, as you can see, Absalom is consoling his sister and shaking his fist that he will have revenge against Amnon one day, but he does not go after Amnon then. And he never speaks to Amnon about this incident, but we're told that he hated Amnon and would plot a revenge against him. So 2 years later, let me see that last picture we got there, just the last one, the next one, so I can, where am I at with that? Oh yeah, okay, here we go. We won't show this picture yet, but we're coming to it. 2 years later, when Absalom had just finished the time when he was shearing all of his sheep, he wanted to have a big celebration. Imagine there was a lot of sheep and there was probably a lot of money to be had. So he went to David and said he wanted to throw a big celebration, and he wanted to invite all of David's sons. You have to remember now, these sons are from multiple wives. Some of them are daughters from kings from other lands, and also, even though these are all sons of David, many of them are just half brothers. Most of them, they all have different mothers, and so there's love lost with no love lost between many of them. So Absalom has this party. He gets all of David's sons to come to the party, and he turns to his servants and he tells them, when Anon is good and drunk, I'll give you a signal and I want you to kill him. Of course, they're very nervous about that. He is the son of the king. But Absalom tells him, don't worry, I'll tell him it was my order and I will take responsibility for it. So as you can see in this last picture we have here, this is the death of Anon as he's sitting at the party, and back here somewhere, I can never figure out where I am, and they are attacking him and killing him at the table here. So the men did this for Absalom, and when they do this, all the other brothers scatter out into the land and get on their mules and make a run for it. And word gets back to David before any of them return to Jerusalem that Absalom killed all of David's sons. And David is thrown into a frenzy. All of his closest advisors, they all tear their clothes and throw themselves on the floor and start to wail. But finally, one of David's sons makes his way back to David, Jonadab, and tells him this isn't true at all, that Anon was the only one that was killed by Absalom, and that the rest of them are okay, and eventually David sees the rest of them coming towards Jerusalem. But he finds out that Absalom has escaped to his grandfather, Talmai, who is a king of Geshur, the city of Geshur, and he ends up staying there for 3 years. We're told that David mourned the loss of his son Amnon for some time, but after a few years started to also long to be reunited with Absalom, as he deep down understood why Absalom would do this to Amnon. And that's the story. If you read ahead into the 14th chapter, you will find out what happens to Absalom with, little spoiler alert here, the help of David's general Joab. Maybe not what you expect, but it's a good story. You might read ahead of that for our next video that we'll put up, which should be next Sunday, God willing. So that's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed some of these stories and some of this information. We will continue next week, chapter 14, 2 Samuel. And again, we will see you hopefully as we continue our journey to Damascus.
We hope you have enjoyed our discoveries for today. Please join us next time as we explore the insights of the Old Testament on the journey to Damascus.